He leaned in, smiling, just loud enough for everyone to hear, reminding the room that she used to be his wife, and now she served drinks. Glasses rattled in her hands. The crowd watched, and he thought he was untouchable. What he didn't know was that the man standing behind her owned the room and was about to end him. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. 5 years. For 5 years, Jeannie Clement had rebuilt herself from nothing. Survival by brutal survival. Over the ashes Nicholas had left behind. But one night at an exclusive alumni reunion in the very hotel where she now worked, he tried to burn her down again. He stood before their former classmates in his tailored tuxedo, his voice soaked in false concern, painting her as a cautionary tale, a discarded wife who'd fallen as far as ambition could drop. He thought he had her cornered, shamed, and silenced. He thought the room belonged to him. He never imagined the man who owned it had been watching every move he made. The assignment notice had been sitting in her employee locker for 2 weeks. A single printed sheet clipped to the weekend schedule. Platinum Ballroom, Street Laurent Alumni Gala. Full service required. Jeanne Clement, no. She was only Jeanne now. Stripped even of the surname she'd once shared with him, had stared at those words until they blurred. Her fingers had traced the edges of the paper, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times, a familiar tightness building in her chest. It wasn't the reunion itself that made her hands shake. It wasn't the whispers, the pity, the inevitable questions from people who remembered her as someone else entirely. It was him, Nicholas. The name alone was a scar that had never properly healed, a wound she'd learned to live with, stitched closed but still tender, still capable of splitting open at the slightest pressure. The break room door opened quietly. Jeanne didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Timothée Roussel moved through his own hotel the way shadows moved through light, silent, inevitable. Impossible to ignore once you'd noticed him. He was a man built from a different kind of authority than Nicholas. Where Nicholas was all polished surfaces and calculated charm, Timothée was the unshakable weight of stone beneath still water. Ink climbed from beneath his collar, dark lines that hinted at stories he never told. His presence didn't demand attention, it commanded it without asking. He set a cup of coffee beside her on the metal table, his voice low and steady. "You're thinking about tomorrow night." It wasn't a question. Jeanne exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping half an inch. "It's absurd, isn't it? That I still let him get to me like this. It's been 5 years since the divorce." "Wound's close, Jeannie," Timothée said quietly, his dark eyes resting on her with something close to understanding. "But scars don't disappear. He wasn't just your husband. He was the man who taught you what cruelty looked like when it smiled." His knuckles brushed the back of her hand just once, deliberate and grounding. "You don't owe him your fear." "Not anymore." Jeannie looked down at the schedule still clutched in her other hand, at the life she'd clawed her way into, at the uniform that had become armor instead of shame. She had survived Nicholas Lambert once. Tomorrow night, she would do it again. But survival had come at a price Jeannie had never imagined paying. 5 years earlier, she had been Jeanne Lambert, wife of one of the city's most promising financial strategists. Nicholas had been everything ambition wrapped itself around, sharp-minded, relentlessly confident, the kind of man who walked into rooms and made them feel smaller simply by existing in them. She had loved him the way you love a wildfire. Beautifully, dangerously, without realizing you're standing too close until the heat has already scarred you. Their life had looked flawless from the outside. Private charity galas, weekend retreats in the countryside, dinner parties where influence was traded like currency, and Jeannie played her role perfectly poised, gracious, just intelligent enough to charm but never threaten. She had believed she was building something permanent, a partnership, a future. She hadn't realized she was being constructed. Nicholas controlled everything. The guest lists, the friendships, the way she dressed, the way she spoke in public, the version of herself she was allowed to be. He called it refinement. He called it love. And for years, Jeannie had believed him because the alternative that she had married a man who saw her as an accessory, a reflection of his own success, was too unbearable to accept. Then the cracks began to show. Nicholas's investments, the ones he'd always spoken about with such certainty, started collapsing, quietly at first. A missed return here, a delayed payout there. But Nicholas was never a man who accepted failure, especially not his own. So he did what he had always done best. He redirected the narrative. Documents were altered, signatures forged, conversations reframed in emails Jeannie never remembered sending. By the time the financial regulators came knocking, Nicholas had built an entire architecture of blame, and Jean was its foundation. She was the one who had mismanaged the accounts, the one whose poor judgment had led to risky decisions, the one who had been in over her head from the beginning. And because Nicholas was charming, because he was well-connected, because he knew exactly how to position himself as the victim of his wife's incompetence, the story stuck. The divorce was swift and surgical. Jeannie's accounts were frozen pending investigation. Her reputation evaporated overnight. Friends stopped returning calls. Invitations stopped arriving. The life she had known simply ended. Nicholas emerged unscathed. Wounded, perhaps, in the public eye, tragic even. The man who had loved too blindly and paid the price but unscathed. Within a year, he was rebuilding. Within 2, he was thriving. Jeannie was left with nothing but debt, suspicion, and a name that opened no doors. She had taken the first job she could find, then the second, then the third. Rent didn't care about dignity. Survival didn't wait for pride to catch up. She moved from administrative temping to retail to finally, mercifully, a position at one of the city's most exclusive hotels. The work was invisible. That was the point. She learned how to carry trays without trembling, how to respond to dismissiveness with silence, how to exist in rooms full of people who would never see her as anything more than part of the furniture. It was not the life she had imagined, but it was hers. And in the quiet, grinding repetition of it, Jeannie had learned something Nicholas never could, that survival, real survival, didn't require applause. It only required waking up and choosing to continue. Now, standing in the break room with Timothy's coffee growing cold beside her, Jeannie folded the assignment notice one last time and slipped it into her pocket. Tomorrow night, she would walk into that ballroom. She would see Nicholas again, and she would endure. Nicholas Lambert had always known how to make an entrance. Tonight was no different. The Street Laurent Alumni Gala was in full swing by the time he arrived, fashionably late in the way that only the truly confident could afford to be. The platinum ballroom shimmered with golden light from the crystal chandeliers overhead, casting warm halos across marble floors and silk-draped tables. Laughter rolled through the space like champagne bubbles, expensive, effervescent, empty. Nicholas paused just inside the double doors, letting the moment settle around him. He wore his tuxedo the way other men wore armor, perfectly tailored, midnight black with satin lapels that caught the light just so. His dark hair was swept back with deliberate casualness, a few strands falling artfully across his forehead. Even his stubble looked calculated, the kind of grooming that whispered effortless while costing a fortune to maintain. He smiled wide, bright, absolutely certain of his welcome, and the room responded exactly as he'd known it would. "Nicholas! My God, is that really you? Lambert! Get over here, you bastard! Looking good, man. Really good." They swarmed him within seconds. Old classmates, former teammates, people whose names he'd half forgotten but whose admiration he'd never doubted. Handshakes turned into backslaps. Backslaps turned into embraces. Someone thrust a glass of scotch into his hand, and Nicholas accepted it with the ease of a man who had never questioned whether he deserved good things, because he had won. 5 years after the divorce, 5 years after the scandal that should have buried him, Nicholas Lambert had done what he always did. He had climbed. New investors, new ventures, a penthouse in the financial district with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a conquest. He'd rebuilt his reputation brick by polished brick, and tonight, standing in this ballroom surrounded by people who remembered him only as successful, he was the living proof that resilience, his kind of resilience, always paid off. "Still can't believe you pulled off the Singapore deal," someone said, clapping him on the shoulder. "That was ballsy, even for you." Nicholas grinned, swirling his scotch. "Fortune favors the bold, my friend. Always has." What he didn't say, what he never said, was how many people he'd stepped on to get there, how many contracts he'd manipulated, how many partnerships he'd quietly sabotaged, how many times he'd redirected blame when his own decisions went south. Winners didn't apologize. Winners rewrote history. And Nicholas Lambert was very good at winning. He moved through the ballroom like a king, surveying his territory, stopping at every cluster of conversation, collecting admiration like taxes. They asked about his business, his travels, his life. And Nicholas delivered exactly what they wanted. Success wrapped in self-deprecating humor, ambition softened by charm. No one mentioned Jean. At least, not directly. But Nicholas could feel the unspoken question hovering in the spaces between compliments, the curiosity, the gossip that had circulated years ago, whispered behind cupped hands and closed doors. Poor Nicholas. Married the wrong woman, nearly ruined him. He'd worked hard to shape that narrative, to position himself as the victim of misplaced trust, the man who'd loved too deeply and learned the hard way. It had worked. People pitied him for surviving her, and that pity had turned into respect. Nicholas took another sip of scotch, savoring the burn, and let his gaze drift across the room. The ballroom was packed now, alumni reconnecting over past hors d'oeuvres and nostalgic lies about how much they'd all changed. The hotel staff moved between them like ghosts, silent, efficient, invisible. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought he'd imagined it. A trick of the light, maybe, or too much scotch on an empty stomach. But no. There she was, across the ballroom, her dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, wearing a crisp white shirt and black service vest, carrying a tray of champagne flutes with the careful precision of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. Gina, his ex-wife, working as a waitress at his reunion. The shock of it hit him first sharp and cold, like ice water down his spine. Then came something else, something darker and infinitely more satisfying. Oh, this is perfect. Nicholas felt the smile tugging at the corner of his mouth before he could stop it. He'd known, abstractly, that Jeannie had fallen. That was the inevitable consequence of her own failures after all. But seeing it, witnessing it with his own eyes, watching her reduced to serving drinks to people who'd once treated her as an equal, that was something else entirely. That was justice. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was too focused on navigating the crowd, her expression carefully blank, her movements efficient and unobtrusive. She looked smaller than he remembered. Tired, the kind of tired that lived in the bones, that no amount of sleep could cure. Good? She should be tired. She should be exactly where she was. Invisible, irrelevant, erased from the world they'd once shared. Nicholas drained the rest of his scotch and set the empty glass on a passing tray. His pulse quickened not from nerves but from anticipation. This was too good an opportunity to waste. Too delicious. After everything she'd put him through, the investigations, the scrutiny, the months of rebuilding his name, didn't he deserve this? Didn't he deserve to remind her, just once, of how far she'd fallen, of how high he'd climbed? He straightened his bow tie, smoothed his lapels, and began moving through the crowd toward her. Someone called his name, but Nicholas barely heard it. His attention was locked on Jean now, on the way she kept her eyes down, on the careful distance she maintained from the guests. She was trying so hard to be invisible. He was going to make sure everyone saw her. "Excuse me," Nicholas said smoothly, weaving between conversations. "Just need to grab a drink." But he wasn't thirsty. He was hunting. And Gina Clement, no. Not Clement anymore. Not Lambert either. Just Gina, stripped of everything she used to be, had no idea he was coming. Jean had learned to make herself invisible. It was a skill she'd developed over 5 years of service work, honed in hotel ballrooms and corporate events where being noticed meant you'd done something wrong. Keep your head down. Move efficiently. Smile politely when required, but never hold eye contact long enough to suggest you're anything more than part of the decor. Tonight, that invisibility felt like survival. The Platinum Ballroom was full now, packed with faces she recognized from another lifetime. Alumni from Street. Laurent, the elite private college where she'd once belonged, where she'd worn designer dresses instead of a service vest, where her last name had opened doors instead of closing them. She recognized Isabelle Moreau by the bar, laughing too loudly at something a man in a navy suit had said. Isabelle had been in her study group once. They'd spent late nights in the library together, sharing coffee and complaints about Professor Duchamp's impossible exams. Isabelle's eyes had passed right over Jean 20 minutes ago without a flicker of recognition. Or maybe it wasn't lack of recognition at all. Maybe it was something worse. The deliberate choice not to see. Jean adjusted her grip on the serving tray and moved toward the next cluster of guests. 3 champagne flutes, arranged in a perfect triangle. She'd learned that presentation mattered, even in service, especially in service. "Champagne?" she offered quietly to a group near the tall windows. A woman in emerald silk took a glass without looking at her. "Thank you." The words were automatic, empty. Jeannie was already moving away. She made it another 15 feet before she heard the whisper. "Is that? No, it can't be. Oh my God, it is. That's Jeannie Lambert. I heard she lost everything in the divorce, but I didn't realize. Working here? Jesus. That's..." The voices dropped lower, but Jeannie's hearing had sharpened over the years. You learned to catch the things people said when they thought you couldn't hear. Her fingers tightened on the tray. Keep moving. Don't react. Don't give them anything. But her heart was hammering now. A sick, heavy rhythm that made her ribs feel too small. The ballroom suddenly felt suffocating, too bright, too loud, too full of people who remembered her as someone she could never be again. She needed air. Or at least the service corridor. Somewhere away from the eyes, the whispers, the weight of recognition. Jeannie turned toward the kitchen entrance and froze. Nicholas was walking toward her. Not just in her general direction. Directly, deliberately. His eyes locked on hers across the crowd with the kind of focus that left no room for misunderstanding. He'd seen her, and he was coming. No, please, not now. Not here. Jeannie's instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear into the staff corridors and let someone else cover this section of the room. But her feet wouldn't move. Her body had locked up, frozen in that terrible space between fight and flight where neither option felt possible. Nicholas closed the distance in seconds, his smile easy and confident, designed to look friendly to anyone watching. But Jean knew that smile. She'd seen it 1,000 times before, right before he said something that would cut her down while sounding like concern. "Jeannie," he said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to sound genuine. "Wow, I thought that was you, but I wasn't sure." Several heads turned nearby, curious, hungry for drama they could dissect later. Jane forced herself to breathe. "Nicholas, I have to say, I'm surprised to see you here." His gaze traveled deliberately from her face to her vest, to the tray in her hands. "Working the event, that's quite a change." There was a pause, a beat just long enough for the implication to settle. "Quite a fall, you mean?" "It's honest work," Jeannie said quietly, hating how small her voice sounded. "Oh, absolutely. No shame in that at all." Nicholas's smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold. "I think it's admirable, actually. Really. Not everyone has the humility to start over from the bottom." Each word landed like a carefully placed blade. A woman in a black cocktail dress nearby had stopped mid-conversation, her attention fully on them now. Then another guest. Then another. The whispers were spreading, rippling outward through the ballroom like blood in water. "They're watching. Everyone's watching. Could I get you something?" Jean asked, clinging to professionalism like a lifeline. "Champagne? The bar has—" "Actually," Nicholas interrupted smoothly. "I was hoping we could catch up. It's been, 5 years? You look—" He paused, his gaze traveling over her again with theatrical consideration. "Different." The champagne flutes on her tray trembled slightly. "Don't shake. Don't let him see you shake. I'm working, Nicholas. I can't." "Oh, of course. I wouldn't want to keep you from your duties." He reached out and plucked one of the champagne flutes from her tray with casual entitlement. "Must be exhausting, though, being on your feet all night, serving people you used to know as equals." Someone nearby laughed small, uncomfortable, quickly stifled. Jeannie's face burned. Nicholas leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear the venom beneath the false sympathy. "I hope you're managing okay, Jean. Financially, I mean. I know how hard it must be. Rebuilding from everything." His eyes glittered with satisfaction. He was enjoying this. The tray was shaking now, a visible tremor that Jean couldn't control no matter how hard she tried. The remaining champagne flutes clinked softly against each other, the sound absurdly delicate in the heavy silence that had fallen around them. She wanted to scream, to throw the tray at his perfect, smug face, to tell everyone in this room exactly what he'd done to her, how he'd manipulated and framed and destroyed her while walking away clean. But her voice had disappeared, her power had disappeared. She was invisible again, except now. She was the wrong kind of visible, the kind that invited pity and schadenfreude in equal measure. Nicholas straightened, his public smile returning. "Well, it was lovely seeing you, Jean. Take care of yourself." He turned away, champagne in hand, already rejoining a group of admirers who welcomed him back with easy laughter. And Jean stood there, tray trembling in her hands, burning with shame under the weight of 100 watching eyes. She'd survived 5 years of invisibility, but this public execution disguised as a reunion, she didn't know if she could survive this. Timothy Roussel had not been invited to the Street Laurent alumni gala. He didn't need to be. He owned the hotel. He moved through the service corridor behind the Platinum Ballroom with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. Silent footsteps on polished tile, dark eyes absorbing details most people would miss. The kitchen staff nodded as he passed, respectful but not surprised. Timothy walked his property often, appearing in hallways and back offices without warning, checking on operations with the kind of attention that came from knowing exactly how empires crumbled, one overlooked detail at a time. Tonight, though, he wasn't inspecting inventory or reviewing staffing schedules. Tonight, he was looking for someone. He'd noticed her 3 weeks ago, though noticed wasn't quite the right word. You noticed weather, you noticed traffic. What had happened 3 weeks ago was something else entirely. Timothy had been leaving through the service entrance near the loading docks late, past midnight. After a meeting that had required his particular kind of persuasion, he'd been distracted, his mind still running calculations on debts owed and lessons that needed teaching, when he'd heard the voice. Quiet, firm, unafraid. Hey, leave him alone. Timothy had stopped, one hand on the door, and looked back. A woman in a hotel uniform stood between 2 of his kitchen staff and 3 men who had clearly been drinking somewhere less reputable than his bar. The men were bigger, louder, aggressive in that stupid way alcohol made people aggressive. They'd been harassing the younger staff members, cornering them near the dumpsters, making threats that were probably empty but dangerous nonetheless. The woman, Jean, he'd learned later, had stepped directly into the confrontation without hesitation. No backup, no weapon, just her voice and a conviction that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than common sense. "This is private property," she'd said, her tone steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You need to leave. Now." One of the men had laughed, stepping closer. "Or what, sweetheart? You gonna make us?" Timothy had been about to intervene. Violence was often necessary in his world, and he had no patience for men who threatened the vulnerable when Jean had done something unexpected. She'd pulled out her phone, held it up, and smiled. "Not friendly, not afraid. Something else. Security footage is already recording. My manager's on speed dial. And if you take one more step, I'm calling the police and making sure every officer knows exactly where to find you." She'd paused, letting that sink in. "So yes, I'm going to make you. Question is whether you leave embarrassed or in handcuffs." The men had left. And Timothy, watching from the shadows, had recognized something in her he rarely saw, the kind of courage that came from having nothing left to lose. He'd made inquiries, quiet ones, learned her name, her history, the ex-husband who'd destroyed her, the life she'd lost, the quiet, grinding survival she'd built in its place, and he'd remembered. Timothy Roussel did not forget debts, or loyalty, or people who stepped into danger to protect others when no one would have blamed them for walking away. Now, standing in the service corridor with the muffled sounds of the gala bleeding through the walls, Timothy checked his watch. 10:30. The event was in full swing, which meant Jean would be in the ballroom, navigating the kind of crowd that would never see her as anything but help. He'd planned to check in briefly, make sure she was managing, then retreat to his office. Timothy preferred to remain invisible at events like this. His presence tended to change the temperature of a room, and not always in ways that were good for business. But something felt wrong tonight. A tension in the air, perhaps, or instinct honed by years of reading rooms where violence simmered just beneath polite surfaces. Timothy pushed through the staff entrance into the ballroom and stopped just inside, partially concealed by one of the tall marble columns that lined the space. The scene unfolded before him like a play he'd seen too many times before. Power wielded casually, cruelty disguised as charm, someone being dismantled in public while everyone watched. And there, at the center of it, was Jeannie. She stood frozen near the windows, her serving tray trembling visibly in her hands, champagne flutes clinking against each other in a rhythm that matched her breathing fast, shallow, barely controlled. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the kind of trapped panic that came from being seen in the worst possible way, and in front of her, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than Jean made in 6 months, stood a man Timothy didn't recognize but understood immediately, the ex-husband. Timothy's jaw tightened. The man was speaking too quietly for Timothy to hear from this distance, but the body language told him everything. The casual lean, the performative concern, the way his smile never reached his eyes. He was enjoying this, savoring Jeannie's humiliation the way some men savored expensive wine, and the crowd was letting it happen, watching, whispering, feeding on the spectacle. Timothy's hands curled into fists at his sides. He'd spent most of his adult life in a world where violence was currency, where respect was earned through fear and power was maintained through ruthless consistency. He'd done things that would horrify most of the people in this ballroom, made decisions that kept him awake some nights, even when his conscience had long since learned to sleep. But he had rules. You didn't hurt people who couldn't fight back. You didn't mistake cruelty for strength. And you never humiliated someone just because you could. The ex-husband straightened now, taking a champagne flute from Gina's tray with exaggerated courtesy, already turning back toward his admirers. Dismissed her like she was nothing, like she'd always been nothing. Timothy watched Jeannie standing there, tray shaking, shame burning across her face while 100 people pretended not to stare, and something cold and absolute settled in his chest. 3 weeks ago, this woman had stepped between danger and people she barely knew. She'd put herself at risk without hesitation, without expecting anything in return, simply because it was the right thing to do. Timothy Roussel paid his debts, always. He straightened his cuffs, black shirt, no tie, the kind of deliberate casualness that announced he didn't need formal wear to command a room, and began moving through the crowd, not quickly, not dramatically, just deliberately. Conversation quieted in his wake. Not because people recognized him, most didn't, but because some part of the human brain recognized predators even when they moved like prey. Timothy's eyes never left the ex-husband's back. The man was laughing now, champagne raised, completely unaware that the room had just shifted beneath his feet, completely unaware that he'd just made a very serious mistake. Jeannie couldn't move. She stood in the center of the platinum ballroom with a tray of champagne that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and she couldn't move. Her legs had locked. Her breathing had gone shallow. The faces around her blurred into an indistinct mass of judgment and pity and barely concealed satisfaction. This is what she's become. This is how far she fell. Nicholas's laughter carried across the room, rich, easy, the sound of a man who'd never known real consequence. He'd rejoined his circle of admirers near the bar, already recounting some story that had them hanging on his every word. He'd forgotten her already, dismissed her like she was a minor inconvenience, a brief detour in an otherwise perfect evening, just like he'd always done, 7 years earlier. The memory hit without warning, sharp and vivid, pulling Jeanne backward through time with the force of a riptide. She'd been sitting in their penthouse apartment, his penthouse, though he'd always said ours, staring at a bank statement that didn't make sense. Accounts she didn't recognize. Transfers she'd never authorized. Her name signed to documents she'd never seen. Nicholas? She'd found him in his office, surrounded by monitors displaying stock tickers and financial data she'd never fully understood. Can you explain these transactions? There's money moving through accounts under my name, and I don't. It's nothing, Jean. He hadn't looked up from his screens. Just restructuring some assets. Tax optimization. You don't need to worry about it, but my signature is on. I said don't worry about it. His voice had sharpened just enough to make her flinch, then softer, the tone he used when he wanted to seem reasonable. You trust me, don't you? I'm protecting us, protecting our future. She'd wanted to trust him. God. She'd wanted so badly to believe that the man she'd married was acting in their best interest, that her instincts were wrong, that she was being paranoid, so she'd nodded, apologized for questioning him, gone back to being the perfect wife. And Nicholas had smiled. 3 months later, the regulatory investigators had shown up at their door at 7 in the morning. Jeannie had answered in her robe, coffee still brewing in the kitchen, completely unprepared for the way her life was about to detonate. Jean Lambert. We have some questions regarding financial irregularities in several investment accounts registered under your name. She'd looked to Nicholas, confused, waiting for him to explain, to fix this obvious misunderstanding. But Nicholas had looked surprised, concerned, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tremor she'd never heard before. Jeannie, what did you do? The floor had dropped out from under her. 1 month after that, the divorce papers had arrived via courier, clean, efficient, accompanied by a letter from Nicholas's attorney, explaining that while Mr. Lambert sympathized with his wife's regrettable choices, he could not allow her financial mismanagement to further damage his professional reputation. The letter suggested strongly that Jean accept the settlement offer without contest. Fighting would only prolong the investigation, increase legal costs she couldn't afford, and potentially result in criminal charges. Translation: sign, disappear, and consider yourself lucky he wasn't pressing charges himself. Jean had read that letter 17 times, searching for some crack in the narrative, some piece of evidence that would prove what she knew in her bones, that Nicholas had set her up, systematically, deliberately, that he'd used her trust as a weapon, her signature as a shield, her name as a convenient place to dump his own failures. But she had no proof, no allies, no resources to fight a man who'd spent years building exactly this kind of exit strategy. So she'd signed, and watched everything burn. Present, the ballroom snapped back into focus with brutal clarity. Jean was still standing there, tray trembling, the weight of 5 years pressing down on her shoulders like collapsed architecture. She could feel the eyes on her, some curious, some pitying, some gleefully entertained by the spectacle of her humiliation. Nicholas had done this to her once before, in private, with lawyers and documents, and the cold machinery of institutional power. Now he was doing it again, publicly, because he could, because there was no one to stop him, because she was nothing. The tray slipped slightly in her grip, champagne sloshing dangerously close to the rim of the glasses. Move. Just move. Get to the kitchen. Disappear. But her body wouldn't cooperate. Shock had frozen her in place, turned her into a statue of her own shame while the entire room bore witness. Poor thing, someone murmured nearby. I heard she lost everything. Well, you make your choices, don't you? I always thought there was something off about her. Too quiet. Too, I don't know, guilty. The words burrowed under Jeannie's skin like parasites. They believe him. They all believe him. Of course they did. Nicholas was successful, charming, convincing. And Jean? Jean was the cautionary tale. The woman who'd reached too high, married too ambitiously, and paid the price for her presumption. That's what happened when you let a man rewrite history. When you let him control the narrative. The truth became irrelevant. Only the story mattered. And Nicholas had always been exceptional at telling stories. Across the ballroom, Nicholas raised his champagne glass. Her champagne, the one he'd taken from her tray like it was his right and someone proposed a toast. To Nicholas Lambert, proof that you can survive anything if you're smart enough and strong enough. Laughter, applause, glasses clinking. Jean felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart that had broken years ago, had been rebuilt from scar tissue and spite and the grinding necessity of survival. This was something else, something deeper. The last fragile belief that the world was fundamentally fair, that truth mattered, that suffering eventually led to justice. It didn't. The world belonged to men like Nicholas, men who knew how to smile while they destroyed you. Men who understood that power wasn't about being right, it was about being believed. And Jeannie had nothing. No power, no voice, no way to fight back that wouldn't make everything worse. The tray shook harder. One of the champagne flutes tilted dangerously, and Jean realized, with horrible clarity, that she was about to drop it. Right here, in front of everyone. The final humiliation. Then, a presence behind her, close enough that she could feel the shift in air, the displacement of space. A hand reached past her shoulder, careful, deliberate, and steadied the tray. A voice, low and absolutely certain, spoke directly into the silence. I'll take that. The hand that steadied Jeannie's tray was decorated with ink. Dark lines wrapped around strong fingers, disappearing beneath the cuff of a black shirt that had never seen the inside of a corporate boardroom. The touch was firm but not forceful, the kind of control that came from absolute certainty rather than aggression. Jeannie's breath caught. She knew those hands. She'd seen them 3 weeks ago, sliding a €50 tip across the bar with a quiet, "Thank you," after she'd defended his staff. She'd seen them again last week, signing her paycheck in the administrative office, where he sometimes worked late into the night. Timothy Roussel, her employer, the owner of this hotel. And if the whispers in the kitchen were even half true, a man whose influence extended far beyond luxury accommodations and 5-star service. "I'll take that," he said again, his voice pitched low enough that only Jeannie could hear. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that made questioning it feel impossible. Jeannie's fingers loosened on the tray automatically, muscle memory responding to a command her brain was still processing. Timothy lifted it from her hands with practiced ease, as though he'd spent years carrying trays instead of running an empire built on things polite society didn't discuss in ballrooms. For a moment, they stood there, Jean frozen, Timothy directly behind her, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of expensive cologne and something else. Something darker. Smoke, maybe. Or danger. "Go to the kitchen," he said quietly. "Take 10 minutes. Breathe." "I can't, I have to." Jean. Her name in his mouth sounded different than it did in Nicholas's. Not possessive, not dismissive, just present, real. "Go." She went. Her legs moved on autopilot, carrying her through the crowd that had been watching her humiliation with such rapt attention. But now their eyes had shifted. Now they were looking at the man who'd appeared behind her like a shadow gaining substance. The man who currently held her serving tray with the same ease most people held their car keys. Jeannie didn't look back. She pushed through the service door and into the corridor beyond, where the sounds of the gala became muffled and distant. Her hands were shaking worse now, adrenaline flooding her system in delayed reaction. She pressed her palms against the cool tile wall and forced herself to breathe. In, out, behind her, through the small window in the service door, she could see Timothy still standing exactly where she'd left him, holding her tray, looking directly at Nicholas. The ballroom had gone very, very quiet. It happened in stages, conversation dying in ripples, spreading outward from the point where Timothy stood like blood seeping through silk. The alumni who'd been so eager to watch Gina's humiliation now found themselves transfixed by something else entirely. By someone else. Timothy Roussel didn't look like he belonged at a college reunion. He looked like he belonged in darker places. Places where business was conducted without contracts and disagreements were settled without lawyers. His black shirt was open at the collar, revealing more of the intricate tattoos that climbed his neck. No bow tie, no tuxedo jacket, just expensive fabric tailored to fit a body that had clearly seen violence and survived. He stood perfectly still, holding a serving tray, his dark eyes fixed on Nicholas Lambert, with the kind of attention predators gave prey right before they struck. Nicholas, to his credit, recovered quickly. He turned, champagne glass still in hand, and offered the easy smile of a man who'd never met a social situation he couldn't charm his way through. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" Timothy didn't smile back. "No," he said simply. "You don't." The word landed in the silence like a stone in still water. Nicholas' smile wavered slightly. Around them, guests had stopped even pretending to have other conversations. This was better than the reunion itself, drama unfolding in real time, tension thick enough to taste. "Well," Nicholas continued, his tone still friendly but with an edge creeping in. "I appreciate you helping out the staff, but I think we had everything under control. Did you?" It wasn't a question. It was a contradiction, delivered with such flat certainty that it made Nicholas's statement retroactively sound like a lie. Nicholas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Look, I don't know who you are, but this is a private event for Street Laurent alumni. If you're with the hotel staff, perhaps you should. I own the hotel." 4 words, delivered without emphasis, without pride or aggression or any need to prove the claim. Just fact. The silence deepened. Nicholas blinked, his confident expression flickering like a faulty light. "You... what?" "This hotel. I own it." Timothy's gaze never wavered. "Which makes this my ballroom, my event, my space." A pause, deliberate and pointed. "And my employee you were harassing." The word harassing cut through the room like a blade. "I wasn't," Nicholas started, but Timothy interrupted with the kind of quiet certainty that made interruption feel inevitable. "Yes, you were." Someone near the bar coughed uncomfortably. A woman in a red dress suddenly found her phone fascinating. The crowd that had been so eager to witness Jeannie's humiliation now seemed desperate to be anywhere else. Nicholas's face flushed. Not embarrassment, Jean would have recognized that. This was anger, the specific rage of a man used to controlling narratives suddenly losing his grip on the story. "With all due respect," Nicholas said, his voice hardening, "my conversation with my ex-wife is none of your concern." "Your ex-wife," Timothy repeated slowly, as though tasting the words, "is my employee, working in my establishment, which makes her welfare very much my concern." He took a single step forward, not aggressive, not threatening, just closing distance. The champagne flutes on the tray he still held didn't even tremble. "And what I witnessed," Timothy continued, his voice dropping lower, "was a man using his social position to publicly humiliate someone who couldn't defend herself. Someone who was required, by the terms of her employment, to stand there and take it." Nicholas opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time all evening, he had no response, no charm, no deflection, no clever reframing, just silence. And in that silence, power shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but absolutely. The room no longer belonged to Nicholas Lambert. It belonged to the man holding the serving tray, whose quiet presence carried more authority than all of Nicholas's expensive charm combined. Timothy set the tray down on a nearby table with deliberate care. Then, he looked at Nicholas again. "I think," he said quietly, "you should leave." Nicholas Lambert had been asked to leave places before, bars where he'd gotten too drunk, offices where deals had gone sour. Even a country club once, after an incident involving another member's wife that he'd managed to smooth over with apologies and carefully placed donations. But he had never been told to leave while standing in front of a room full of people who were supposed to admire him, not by someone dressed like they'd just walked off a crime scene. Nicholas's hand tightened around his champagne glass. The flush in his cheeks deepened from anger to something darker, more dangerous. Humiliation wrapped in fury, the kind that made men do stupid things. "Excuse me?" His voice came out sharper than intended, loud enough that several guests flinched. "You're telling me to leave? I'm an invited guest at this reunion. I have every right to be here." Timothy didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there with his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression perfectly neutral, radiating the kind of calm that only came from absolutely knowing that you held all the power in a room. "You were invited to an event," Timothy said quietly, "hosted in my hotel, on my property, under terms that include basic standards of behavior." He paused, letting that sink in. "You violated those terms." "I didn't violate anything. I was talking to my ex-wife." "You were humiliating her." The words cut clean through Nicholas's protest. "Deliberately, publicly, using your social position as a weapon while she was required to stand there and serve you." Timothy took another step forward, still not threatening, still perfectly controlled, but the space between them contracted in a way that made Nicholas instinctively step back. "That ends now," Timothy continued. "You can leave with dignity, or you can leave with security. Your choice." The ballroom had gone from quiet to silent, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, that made breathing feel conspicuous. Every single person in the room was watching this unfold like a car crash in slow motion, horrified, fascinated, unable to look away. Nicolas looked around desperately, searching for support, for someone to validate his version of reality. His eyes landed on a cluster of former classmates near the windows. "Gerard, tell him this is absurd, right? I was just catching up with Jeannie. There's no law against talking to your ex-wife." But Gerard had suddenly become very interested in his shoes. The woman next to him, Isabel, who'd been laughing at Nicholas's jokes 20 minutes ago, had her phone out, pretending to check messages. No one met his eyes. "They're not going to help you," Jeannie thought from her position behind the service door, watching through the small window. "They never do. Not when there's risk involved. Not when helping you might cost them something." She'd learned that lesson 5 years ago, watching her entire social circle evaporate the moment Nicholas's narrative made her toxic. People didn't stand up for the disgraced. They barely acknowledged them. But now the roles had reversed. Now Nicholas was the one being publicly dismantled, and the crowd that had enabled his cruelty 20 minutes ago was already distancing themselves, already rewriting the evening's events in their minds so they wouldn't be complicit. Nicholas turned back to Timothy, and something desperate flashed in his eyes. The look of a man realizing he'd badly miscalculated. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he demanded, voice rising. "I'm a senior partner at Chevalier Investments. I manage portfolios worth hundreds of millions. You can't just—" "I can." Timothy's voice remained level, unimpressed. "This is private property. I'm the owner. And you're trespassing. This is insane. Someone get the event coordinator. The event coordinator works for me," Timothy said simply, "as does every person in this hotel. And right now they're all receiving the same instruction. Nicholas Lambert is no longer welcome on these premises." He pulled his phone from his pocket with unhurried precision and typed something quickly. Within seconds, Jeannie saw movement at the ballroom's far entrance. 2 security guards, broad-shouldered, professional, wearing the hotel's signature black uniforms, positioned themselves just inside the doors. Not moving forward, not making a scene, just present, a reminder that Timothy's words carried weight beyond social courtesy. Nicholas saw them too. His face went from flushed to pale, anger draining into something closer to panic. "You're making a mistake," he said, but the confidence had leaked out of his voice. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I have connections. Lawyers. I could make things very difficult for Mr. Lambert." Timothy's voice dropped even lower, barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried through the entire ballroom with perfect clarity. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who destroys people weaker than himself and calls it ambition. A man who frames his ex-wife for his own financial crimes and walks away clean." He paused, his dark eyes boring into Nicholas with surgical precision. "A man who mistakes cruelty for power because he's never encountered the real thing." The air left Nicholas's lungs. "He knows." The realization hit Jeannie like a physical blow. Timothy knows what Nicholas did. I've seen your type before, Timothy continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Men who think money makes them untouchable, who believe the right suit and the right smile can erase any sin. His expression didn't change, but something cold and final entered his eyes. You're wrong. Nicholas opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. For the first time in perhaps his entire adult life, Nicholas Lambert had nothing to say. No deflection, no charm, no clever reframing that would let him regain control of the narrative. He'd been stripped of his primary weapon, his voice, and left standing in front of 100 witnesses with absolutely no power left to wield. Timothy gestured subtly toward the exit. The security guards straightened, ready. Leave, Timothy said quietly. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a fact being delivered in advance. Nicholas would leave. The only question was how much dignity he'd have left when he did. He looked around one last time at the former classmates who wouldn't meet his eyes, at the ballroom where he'd been the star of the evening 30 minutes ago, at the ruins of his perfect reunion. Then he set his champagne glass down on the nearest table with a hand that shook just slightly, and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for him like water around stone, silent, watching, already forgetting him. The security guards followed at a respectful distance, not touching him, not forcing him, just escorting, making sure he actually left. The doors closed behind Nicholas Lambert with a soft final click, and he was gone. The ballroom exhaled. It happened slowly, like air returning to lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. Conversation resumed in careful whispers. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed nervously, then stopped abruptly. Uncertain whether laughter was appropriate yet, Timothy stood exactly where Nicholas had left him, hands relaxed at his sides, expression unchanged. He didn't acknowledge the stares, didn't perform for the audience that was still watching him with the kind of wary fascination usually reserved for wild animals that had wandered into civilization. He simply turned and walked toward the exit Nicholas had just been escorted through, not hurrying, not hiding, just leaving. Behind the service door, Jean's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd watched the entire confrontation through the small window, unable to look away, barely able to process what she'd just witnessed. Nicholas, the man who'd destroyed her life, who'd walked away from their marriage untouched and triumphant, had just been publicly dismantled by a man who spoke in whispers and moved like shadows. And now that man was walking toward the exit, toward Nicholas. Jeannie's body moved before her mind caught up. She pushed through the service door and into the corridor that ran parallel to the ballroom, the staff-only passage that connected to the main lobby. Her shoes made soft sounds against polished tile as she hurried forward, following the route she knew Timothy would take. She found them near the lobby's side entrance. Nicholas stood rigid near the glass doors, flanked by the 2 security guards who maintained a professional distance close enough to intervene, far enough to avoid outright confrontation. His tuxedo looked rumpled now, his perfect hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it. The confidence he'd worn like armor had cracked, revealing something smaller underneath. Timothy approached without urgency, his footsteps barely audible on the marble floor. Nicholas turned at the sound, his face twisting with an emotion Jeannie couldn't quite name. Rage, maybe, or fear pretending to be rage. "Are you satisfied?" Nicholas demanded, his voice echoing in the empty lobby. "Humiliating me in front of everyone I know? Destroying my reputation based on lies from a woman who—" "Mr. Lambert." Timothy's voice cut through the outburst like a knife through silk. Quiet. Precise. Absolute. "Your security escort ends here, but I need you to understand something before you leave." He moved closer, and the security guards stepped back slightly, giving them space but remaining vigilant. Jeannie pressed herself against the wall near the corridor entrance, close enough to hear, far enough to remain unseen. "I don't make threats," Timothy said, his voice pitched low enough that Jeannie had to strain to catch the words. "I don't posture. I don't waste time on intimidation. So what I'm about to tell you isn't a warning. It's simply information you should have." Nicholas's jaw clenched. "I don't know what Jean told you, but—" "She told me nothing." The words landed with finality. "I don't need her testimony to know what you are. I've seen men like you my entire life. Men who build success on other people's destruction, who frame the innocent and walk away clean because they understand how to manipulate systems designed to protect them." Timothy's expression remained perfectly neutral, but something in his eyes had gone cold. Not angry. Worse than angry. Clinical. "You want to know what separates you from me, Mr. Lambert?" He didn't wait for an answer. I own what I am. The things I've done, the power I wield, the fear I generate. I don't hide behind legitimacy or charm. I don't pretend my hands are clean. He took another step forward. Nicholas tried to hold his ground but failed, backing up until his shoulders hit the glass door. But you, Timothy continued, you commit the same cruelties and call them business decisions. You destroy lives and frame it as self-preservation. You're violence in a suit, and you've convinced yourself that makes you civilized. I don't have to listen to this. Yes, Timothy said quietly. You do. The security guards shifted slightly, a subtle reminder of their presence. Nicholas's face had gone pale now, the flush of anger replaced by something closer to genuine fear. Your investments with Chevalier, Timothy said, his tone conversational now, almost casual. The Singapore deal you've been so proud of, the venture capital fund you're launching next quarter. They all depend on relationships, trust, perception. He paused, letting Nicholas process the implications. Those things are more fragile than you realize. One conversation with the right person, one audit that asks the right questions, one journalist who decides your success story deserves closer examination. Timothy's gaze never wavered. Your empire isn't as stable as you think it is. Are you threatening me? Nicholas's voice cracked slightly. No. Timothy's response was immediate, certain. I'm educating you. There's a difference. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card, plain, cream-colored, with only a phone number printed on it. No name, no title, just digits. He held it out to Nicholas, who took it automatically, his hands trembling slightly. That's a private investigator, Timothy said. Someone who specializes in financial crimes. Someone very, very good at finding irregularities in investment portfolios. Especially irregularities that involve fraudulent signatures and misattributed liability. Nicholas's face went from pale to gray. I haven't hired him, Timothy continued. Yet. Whether I do, depends entirely on your choices from this moment forward. What do you want? The question came out barely above a whisper. I want you to understand that the woman you humiliated tonight, the woman you framed, bankrupted, and erased, is not as alone as you thought she was. Timothy's voice dropped even lower. I want you to understand that there are people who remember loyalty, who pay debts, who don't forget when someone protects the vulnerable. He stepped back, creating distance again. And I want you to understand that if I ever hear you've contacted Jeannie Clement again, if you approach her, speak about her, even think about her in a way that affects her life, this conversation will be the kindest interaction you and I ever have. The lobby was silent, except for the distant sound of the gala continuing in the ballroom. Nicholas stared at the business card in his hand like it was a grenade with the pin pulled. There's no law against talking to my ex-wife, he said, but the defiance had drained from his voice, leaving only hollow repetition. You're right, Timothy agreed. There's no law. But laws aren't the only thing that governs behavior, Mr. Lambert. Sometimes it's simply understanding who has power and who doesn't. He gestured toward the door. Leave now. Drive carefully. Go home and consider whether your pride is worth what it might cost you. Nicholas looked like he wanted to say something to salvage some scrap of dignity, to issue his own threats, to reassert control over a situation that had thoroughly escaped him. But he didn't. He just turned, pushed through the glass doors, and walked into the night. The security guards waited until he'd crossed the parking circle and disappeared into the darkness before nodding to Timothy and returning to their posts. Timothy stood alone in the lobby for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without turning around, he spoke. You can come out now, Jeannie. Jeannie's breath caught. She stepped out from the corridor, her uniform feeling suddenly too tight, her hands still trembling from adrenaline and shock and something else she couldn't name. Timothy turned to face her, his dark eyes finding hers across the marble expanse. I told you to take 10 minutes, he said quietly. That was barely 5. Jeannie opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, to thank him. She didn't even know where to start. But Timothy raised a hand, stopping her. Don't, he said simply. You don't owe me gratitude. I did what should have been done 5 years ago. He walked toward her slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. The question is, he continued, his voice gentle now, what do you want to do? Jeannie blinked. I don't understand. The ballroom is still full of people who watched him humiliate you, people who remember you as his victim. Timothy's gaze held hers steadily. You can go home right now, end your shift, let someone else finish the evening. Or, he paused. You can go back in there. Jean stared at Timothy like he'd just suggested she walk back into a burning building. Go back? Her voice came out strangled. After what just happened? Yes. The single word carried no judgment, no pressure, just possibility. Jeannie shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. I can't. They all saw. Everyone watched him tear me apart. They watched me stand there like a victim, like someone who couldn't even defend herself. They watched you survive, Timothy corrected quietly. There's a difference. That's not how they'll remember it. Then change the memory. Jeannie's eyes snapped to his. What? Timothy moved closer, his voice dropping to that low, steady tone that somehow made impossible things sound reasonable. Right now, those people think they know your story. They think they watched the final act the disgraced wife brought low, the powerful ex-husband victorious, the dramatic reversal when someone unexpected intervened. He paused. But they're wrong. That wasn't the final act. You are. The words hit Jeannie like a physical impact. Timothy's expression remained calm, but intensity burned behind his eyes. I can remove people who hurt you. I can threaten consequences. I can protect you from future harm, but I can't give you back what he took from you 5 years ago. He let that settle before continuing. Only you can do that. By walking back into that room. By standing in front of people who think they know what happened, and telling them the truth. Jeannie's throat tightened. They won't believe me. They didn't believe me 5 years ago when it mattered. Why would they believe me now? Because 5 years ago, Nicholas controlled the narrative. He had lawyers, resources, social capital. You had nothing. Timothy's gaze held hers steadily. But tonight, I just removed his power in front of 100 witnesses. I just proved that he's not untouchable, that his version of events isn't the only one that matters. He gestured back toward the ballroom. Right now, those people are confused, uncertain. The story they thought they knew just got complicated, which means they're actually capable of listening, maybe for the first time. Jean felt tears burning behind her eyes. I don't know if I can. You can, Timothy said simply. I've seen you face down drunk men threatening my staff. I've watched you work double shifts without complaint. I've seen you survive 5 years of a life you never deserved. His voice softened. You're stronger than you think, Jean Clement. You always have been. The tears spilled over. Jean pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to contain the flood of emotion that had been building all evening, all 5 years, really. Shame and rage and grief and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. What if I can't find the words? She whispered. You will. What if they don't care? Some won't. Timothy's honesty was brutal but somehow comforting. But some will. And you'll know who's worth knowing going forward. Jean lowered her hands, looking at him through blurred vision. This man who barely knew her, who owed her nothing, who'd just defended her anyway because it was right. Why are you doing this? She asked. Really? Timothy was quiet for a long moment. Because 3 weeks ago, you stepped between danger and people you barely knew, he said finally. You didn't have to. You gained nothing from it. You just did it because someone needed to. He held her gaze. Tonight someone needs to speak, and I think it should be you. Jeannie walked back into the platinum ballroom, with her heart in her throat and her hands clenched at her sides. The gala had resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were quieter now, more careful. People kept glancing toward the exit Nicholas had been escorted through, then at each other, processing what they'd witnessed. When Jean entered, heads turned. Not with pity this time, with curiosity, uncertainty, the desperate human need to understand what had just happened. Jeannie moved toward the center of the room, her legs shaking but carrying her forward anyway. She passed the spot where she'd stood, frozen with her trembling tray. Past the table where Nicholas had dismissed her like she was nothing. Someone near the bar whispered something. Another person shushed them. The room gradually quieted. Jeannie stopped in the open space near the dance floor. The chandeliers cast golden light across marble and silk, across faces she'd known in another life. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than she wanted. But it was hers. My name is Jeannie Clement. More heads turned. The remaining conversations died. Some of you knew me as Gina Lambert, Nicholas's wife. She forced herself to breathe. The woman who lost everything because of her own failures, her own poor judgment. A few uncomfortable shifts in the crowd. That's the story Nicholas told. The story investigators believed. The story that followed me for 5 years while he rebuilt his reputation and his wealth. Gina's voice grew steadier. It's also a lie. Someone gasped softly. Isabel, her former study partner, was staring at her with wide eyes. Nicholas didn't just divorce me. He framed me. The words felt both terrifying and liberating. He used my signatures without permission. He created documents I never saw, and when his investments collapsed, he made sure my name was attached to every failure while his remained clean. She looked around the room, meeting eyes that wouldn't meet hers earlier. I had no proof, no resources to fight him. So I lost everything. My home, my reputation, my entire life. Her voice cracked slightly. And I spent 5 years believing that meant I deserved it. That I must have done something wrong. That powerful, successful people don't just destroy someone for convenience. Tears ran down her cheeks now, but she didn't wipe them away. But tonight, watching Nicholas try to humiliate me one more time, I realized something. Jeannie's voice strengthened. Losing him wasn't my failure. It was my escape. The ballroom was completely silent. I survived, Jeannie continued, without his money, without his name, without anything except the determination to keep breathing, keep working, keep existing. She straightened her shoulders. And that is more real than anything Nicholas ever built. She took a shaky breath. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm not asking for your pity or your friendship. I'm just telling you the truth. Finally, because I'm done letting him own my story. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then someone started clapping, slowly at first. Just one person near the windows, then another, and another. Isabel set down her drink and began applauding, tears streaming down her face. The applause spread through the ballroom like a wave, not everyone, but enough to matter. Jeannie stood there, crying openly now, as the room she'd been afraid to enter gave her something she hadn't expected. Not redemption, but acknowledgement, the truth, finally heard. The platinum ballroom had transformed. Not physically, the chandeliers still cast their golden glow. The marble floors still gleamed, the silk drapes still framed floor-to-ceiling windows. But the atmosphere had shifted in a way Jeanne could feel in her bones. The space no longer belonged to old hierarchies and carefully maintained social positions. It belonged, for this moment at least, to truth. The applause faded gradually, replaced by the sounds of people moving, conversing, existing in a room where something fundamental had just changed. Several alumni approached Jeannie, some offering apologies for their silence, others simply sharing quiet acknowledgement. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. Isabel reached her first, mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "Jeanne," she breathed, then stopped, words failing. She tried again. "I should have 5 years ago. I should have." "You couldn't have known," Jeanne said, and was surprised to find she meant it. He was very convincing. "I could have asked. I could have listened." Isabel's voice broke. "Instead, I just disappeared. Like everyone else." Jeanne reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. "You're here now." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more complicated: acknowledgement that the past couldn't be rewritten, but the present could still be chosen. Other conversations followed, some genuine, some performative. Jeannie found she could tell the difference now, could see which apologies came from actual remorse and which came from social obligation or the desire to be on the right side of a dramatic story. She accepted them all with the same quiet grace, because this wasn't about them anymore. Throughout it all, Jeannie caught glimpses of Timothy at the ballroom's edge, his dark figure barely noticeable against the marble columns. He wasn't watching her, or if he was subtle about it. Just present. A reminder that she hadn't been alone, even when she'd felt most isolated. Eventually, the crowd's attention shifted naturally back to the reunion itself. The drama had peaked and passed, and people were already beginning the process of incorporating tonight's events into their personal narratives, deciding how they'd tell the story later. Jeanne slipped away quietly. She found Timothy in the hotel's private office on the second floor, a space she'd only glimpsed in passing, all dark wood and leather and the faint scent of expensive whiskey. He was standing by the window, silhouetted against the city lights, looking out at the streets below. He turned when she entered, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to come find me," he said. "I know." Jeanne closed the door behind her. "But I needed to say thank you. Properly, not in front of an audience." Timothy shook his head slightly. "I told you. You don't want gratitude, I remember." Jeannie moved closer. "But I'm giving it anyway, because what you did tonight." Her voice caught. "No one has stood up for me like that in 5 years. No one has treated what happened to me as if it mattered." "It did matter," Timothy's response was immediate. It does matter. They stood in silence for a moment, the city humming beyond the window. What happens now? Jeanne asked quietly. With Nicholas? Nothing, if he's smart. Timothy's tone was neutral. Everything, if he's not. Either way, he'll never be a problem for you again. How can you be sure? Because men like Nicholas are predators. They target the vulnerable, the isolated, the people who can't fight back. His dark eyes found hers. You're none of those things anymore. Jeanne felt something shift in her chest. Not healing that would take longer, but the beginning of something. A crack in the armor of shame she'd worn for 5 years, letting light through. I still have to work here, she said. Still have to serve drinks at galas. Still have to exist in spaces where people might remember tonight and judge me. Yes, Timothy agreed. But now they'll also remember that you spoke, that you stood in front of them and claimed your truth even when it would have been easier to hide. He moved toward his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out an envelope. Your paycheck, he said, holding it out, plus a bonus for completing tonight's shift under difficult circumstances. Jeanne took it, feeling the weight of it. Probably more than a normal bonus. Probably Timothy's way of helping without making it obvious charity. Thank you, she said again. Timothy nodded once, then turned back to the window. A clear dismissal, though not unkind. Just the behavior of a man who'd done what needed doing and saw no reason to linger in the aftermath. Jeanne started toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Timothy? Yes, the investigator. The one whose card you gave Nicholas. She hesitated. Does he actually exist? Timothy's reflection in the window showed the barest hint of a smile. Does it matter? Jeanne considered that. The threat had been effective, whether real or not. Nicholas believed it. That belief would govern his behavior going forward. I suppose it doesn't, she admitted. Then consider it another story, Timothy said quietly. One that serves its purpose by existing as possibility rather than fact. Jeanne smiled despite herself. You're a complicated man, so I've been told. She left him there, silhouetted against the city, and made her way back downstairs. The hotel lobby was quieter now. The gala would continue for another hour, but Jeanne's shift had effectively ended the moment she'd walked back into that ballroom and spoken. She changed out of her uniform in the staff locker room, pulling on jeans and a sweater, removing the vest that had felt like armor and vulnerability in equal measure. Her reflection in the small mirror looked tired, older than 32. But something in her eyes had changed. She looked solid, present, real. Jeanne packed her uniform carefully, closed her locker, and walked through the hotel's side exit into the night. The air was cool, late autumn, promising winter. The city sprawled around her, lights and traffic, and the constant hum of life continuing regardless of individual dramas. Jeanne stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, envelope in her pocket, car keys in her hand. 5 years ago, Nicholas had taken everything from her home, her reputation, her sense of self. But standing here now, after speaking her truth in a room full of witnesses, after being defended by someone who barely knew her but recognized her worth anyway, Jeanne realized something crucial. Nicholas hadn't destroyed her. He'd stripped away everything false, everything built on his approval and his narrative, and what remained, the part that had survived poverty and shame and 5 years of grinding survival, that part was entirely, absolutely hers. That part couldn't be taken. She started walking toward her car, her steps steady. Tomorrow she'd wake up in her small apartment. She'd still have bills to pay and shifts to work. She'd still be building a life from fragments, still figuring out who she was beyond Nicholas's shadow. But tonight, she'd spoken. Tonight, she'd stood in front of her past and refused to let it define her future. Jeanne Clement walked away from the hotel, from the reunion, from Nicholas, from the woman she'd been when the evening started, and felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years. Not happiness exactly, not peace, but possibility. The future, open and uncertain and entirely her own. She got in her car, started the engine, and drove home, whole. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.